Welcome to This Week in Immigration, the Bipartisan Policy Center's regular podcast discussing the latest in immigration news and policy. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. Today's podcast is being recorded live at the Unconvention 2022 at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. The Unconvention was jointly sponsored by the BPC, Unite America, and Michael Smerconish, CNN, SiriusXM, and podcast host. The Unconvention is a place for Republicans, Democrats, and Independents to gather to talk about how to bring the country together, address important issues, and help to fix our national body politic. Throughout the event, we are asking delegates their thoughts about immigration and what it will take to improve our immigration system and get our elected leaders to come together to do so. We're also interviewing John Wood Jr., a national leader for Braver Angels, about how to have better, more constructive conversations about political issues like immigration. Michael Steele, former Republican National Committee Chair and Maryland Lieutenant Governor, about how much has changed for the Republican Party on the issue over the last decade and how both parties can be more constructive in addressing immigration. And Nick Troiano, Executive Director of Unite America, to get his thoughts about how to address the growing partisan divide over immigration. Lots to come, so stay tuned. People with a variety of different life experiences and experiences with immigration came to the Unconvention and shared their thoughts with us. BPC's Managing Director of Immigration, Theresa Cardinal, talked to a DACA recipient about why she came to the Unconvention, what her experiences sharing her story have been, the recent DACA decision from the Fifth Circuit, and her hopes for the future of the program.
Okay, and we're back with This Week in Immigration from the Unconvention 2022. And I'm here with a young woman who I asked randomly, do you have an immigration story? She said, yes, I do. So I am asking you if you would mind sharing your immigration story with our podcast audience.
I am a DACA recipient. I was born in Mexico. I came to the U.S. when I was 6 years old. I am the oldest of 7. I have 2 sisters who are, one is a DACA recipient, the other one is DACA eligible. But unfortunately, because of the ongoing litigation in the courts with DACA, that third sister is not able to secure her DACA status. And so it's a big issue right now where we have 80,000 applications that need to be processed so that those 80,000 DACA recipients can get their status. However, there are other young undocumented students specifically who are in universities and who don't have a status, and that means that they can't work, they can't drive, they can't do the things that a regular young person should be able to do. And so we definitely need to have a fix to this broken immigration system, but in a way that is bipartisan, so that both sides can be happy about the solution.
Yeah, so you obviously have a personal interest in this issue, but you're advocating for bipartisanship. So what do you think is the best way to kind of get people together to talk about it and come up with that solution that both sides can agree with?
Yeah, I think definitely putting a face to the stories. I started activism when I was 19 years old. I was a sophomore in college, and that was when DACA was rescinded for the first time. And as a 19-year-old, I had no idea where to start, first of all. But all I knew was that DC was the place to make the change happen. And regardless of how I knew how to lobby or how I did it, I was able to share my story. And that's not something you need, professional or formal training for. Nobody else can tell your story better than you can. And so definitely putting a face to the issue has always been one of the biggest things that I've been able to use to, even change the minds of some individuals.
So was it scary for you the first time you told your story, and how was it received?
It was scary, but at the same time, I was 19 years old. At that age, you don't really think about things, and you just do them because, you have to. And I was doing it for my sister, who at the time became of age to apply for DACA, but wasn't able to. And so I was doing it for her. And so to a certain extent, I wasn't scared, to do it. I just knew that I had to.
How was your story received? You've talked to a lot of different people
Yes,
about your
yes,
story.
people from both sides of the aisle. Yes.
How's it been received?
Very well. I actually, doing some town hall meetings, was able to speak, share my story with some individuals who have some misconceptions about immigrants. More commonly that we don't pay taxes, which is a
Right.
huge misconception, which in fact we do.
We have a huge blog on the Bipartisan Policy Center website that says, do undocumented immigrants pay taxes? And it is the most visited page
Yes.
on the entire Bipartisan Policy Center
Yes.
website. The answer, by the way,
Is
for
yes.
the audience is yes. Yes, they do.
That's right. Yes. Just to clarify that again.
Clarify that. Yes.
Yes. So there are some people who you can't blame them for not knowing that, and that's why I like to be in those spaces where I know there may be people who are not for a lot of immigration policies, and so that they can know those misconceptions exist.
Yeah, so this has been a very big week for DACA
Yes,
and DACA recipients.
yes.
We just had this Fifth
Right.
Circuit Court decision,
Right.
punted it back to the lower court.
Right.
What is your hope that comes out in Congress or in this next year for the DACA program?
Honestly, I just want to be able to get on a pathway to citizenship. And not just me, but I want to be able to get that. People like my sister who are waiting, she's a junior in college and she's going to have a degree but no job. How is that fair? So I want to be able to see more of those undocumented young students, young individuals, to also have the opportunity to gain a status so they can, live a life that any American should, but also can't forget about our parents, the original dreamers, right? They're the ones who did the hard thing of leaving the country. My parents were doctors in Mexico, and they came. They had no other option because they were targeted by gang members and violence. And so to them, there was no other option. What do you do when you have 3 little girls and you're being constantly targeted? And so for them, you can't forget people like our parents who brought us here across borders so that we could have a better and safer future.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you for being on This Week in Immigration, and enjoy the rest of the convention.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we welcome John Wood Jr. to the podcast, who is here as a speaker for Braver Angels, an organization dedicated to political depolarization. He'll talk with Theresa about techniques the organization teaches for having better, more constructive conversations around politically controversial issues like immigration.
So I'm here with John Wood, who is a national ambassador of sorts for the organization Braver Angels. So John, tell our listeners at This Week in Immigration what Braver Angels is.
Absolutely, and thank you very much. Braver Angels is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. But I tend to like to deepen that explanation by saying what we're really committed to is the reviving of the communal fabric of American democracy. It's easy to look at all sorts of ways in which our democratic culture, our institutions, our systems seem to be losing their credibility and perhaps not functioning the way they should be. And so we can think about polarization as a technical problem, but the root of it really is just the loss of social trust and civic trust between the American people. That filters up to our institutions, and of course we've got major, powerful figures and interests that exploit that and worsen it. But ultimately, the cancer that we're suffering from is a cancer of trust, or distrust, rather. And that's the problem that Braver Angels seeks to address.
Yeah. So one thing that you do is you get people in local communities to get together who may have differing opinions, come from different backgrounds, and sometimes they have difficult conversations. Can you tell me how you teach or coach people to work their way through some of those conversations?
Sure, and of course we have many different ways of doing that, and part of the power of the Braver Angels experience, especially if you find yourself participating with us potentially as a member or going through our different programs, is that we sort of take people through a number of different journeys to sort of strengthen their civic muscle, if you will, in terms of learning not just how to communicate, not just how to hear one another, not just how to understand each other's stories better, but to also develop direct relationships with people who disagree with you. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So our very first workshop that we developed in the aftermath of the 2016 election, something called a red-blue workshop. And that's one where we take small groups of people who lean left, blues, lean right, reds, bring them into a shared space, not so much to argue or debate politics, at least not at first, but to actually speak from the vantage point of their own personal or lived experience in terms of why they see politics the way that they do. It's quite literally the application of marriage counseling techniques to the relationship, that's right, between Republicans and Democrats. But we also have workshops that really focus in on, for instance, giving people direct sort of communicative techniques, perhaps you could say sort of, conversational tactics for having depolarizing discussions. And so we have something called a skills for bridging the divide workshop, which instructs people in a fairly simple formula. It's called the LAP formula. And so that's LAPP. It starts with listening. Listen to the other person, not to respond, but to actually hear what it is they have to say. Open your ears and then acknowledge what that person says. And what that really involves is paraphrasing their remarks in a way that allow them to hear in your words a representation of their own point of view that they would actually agree with as accurate. And then you go to the first P, which is pivot. It's very simple, but important. Many people will introduce a position in their political opinion and say, it's just a fact that Donald Trump was the best president for the economy, or it's just a fact that Obama was the best president for healthcare. But if instead you were to say, I have a different opinion, or I have a different experience, and here's why I think Barack Obama was the best president for healthcare, for example. You introduce a note of humility that makes it less a competition between facts and more a discussion and exchange between human beings. And then the last part is just offering your perspective, sharing your opinion. But you've set it up by listening, by acknowledging the other party's point of view in a way that shows that you heard them, and then pivoting to your perspective in a way that introduces humility. And that sets the stage for an actual exchange of ideas and points of view that can bring people closer together and not drive them further apart.
So essentially, these seem like a lot of deconflicting techniques, right? It's not about winning the argument so much as having a real conversation about things. Have you personally, or has your organization addressed the issue of immigration, which is one of those polarizing issues in the United States? And sort of what have you seen as outcomes of some of those conversations?
So, I should say that you're absolutely right that our work is about having conversations. But we also deal with debates. We also have programs entirely oriented around debating issues, hard issues, in ways that are constructive. And the Braver Angels Debates program, designed by my good friend and colleague April Lawson Cornfield, is probably our most popular program on college campuses, and it's spread across local communities too. And so we certainly, in the context of dealing with communities, students, and probably elected officials as well, have debated and discussed issues surrounding immigration. And I think what we tend to find is that certainly there's a wide range of perspectives. You do have some people who are perhaps somewhat negative about, the sort of very idea of immigration. Then you have other folks who sort of believe in a very sort of, pure kind of open borders. Some people don't actually believe that there should be borders between nations. The vast majority of Americans recognize, and at least in the work that we have done, it seems to me to be the case that the vast majority of Americans have deep human concern and empathy for those who come to this country seeking a better life. Most Americans seem to recognize the fact that we are a country of immigrants at the end of the day, but people do also have a concern about the rule of law. They believe that borders and border security are important, and they have some concern whether for the economy, whether for safety of their fellow Americans, concerns about drug trafficking and human trafficking and all that. But it's just to say that most people, I think, are looking to find a balance between these concerns, and they don't always see our elected officials striving for the same thing. So Braver Angels provides an outlet for people to reason towards that common ground and to be honest about the full spectrum of their concerns.
And then I think the next step is seeking to take those positions and activate them to talk to their elected leaders about the same way, to help them have those same kind of conversations.
So it's interesting that you say that, because we've recently launched an initiative called Braver Politics. And what that is a systematic effort to seed our workshops at every level of government. Now, we have been working with the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress, and we've got some work that's rolled out in the Senate and the House of Representatives with that joint committee. And we've always done some work here and there with state legislatures and municipalities and even school boards. But with our Braver Politics initiative, the work here is to really mobilize a larger volunteer force to establish this sort of program work at every level of government across the country. And in that context, part of what we're doing is helping elected officials to more constructively engage with their constituents, including constituents who may be very angry about some things, right? It's funny because, a lot of elected officials and their staffs, naturally are just overwhelmed by the polarization, by the anger in our politics. It's reinforced by the media and the way the parties oftentimes tend to campaign. But we do seek to give elected officials and candidates tools for better engaging their constituencies and one another. And so that's certainly an area of work on which we are very much focused.
Well, John Wynn, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here at the Unconvention, and thank you for being on This Week in Immigration.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
We also interviewed delegates throughout the event and asked them to share their thoughts about immigration. I interviewed Dr. Ravi Perry, Chair of Political Science at Howard University, and we touched on how he has constructive conversations about immigration with his students. Hi there. Why don't you tell us your name, where you're from, and what brings you to the Uncon?
I'm Ravi Perry. I am from Toledo, Ohio. I'm a professor of political science at Howard University in Washington, D.C.
Okay, do you have any sort of personal connection to immigration or an immigration story in your background?
Well, yes and no. It depends on how we define immigration. So my family comes from the horrible, of course, chattel slavery tradition in this family of folks who were forced to immigrate here. And from that standpoint, yes, from the standpoint of traditional immigration that we think of people immigrating from other countries, we don't have as much of that in my family, but my family does live in border states.
And what opinions do your family in the border states have, and how do you guys talk about immigration?
Well, for us, immigration is a simple issue. It's an issue of humanity. People are not illegal. That borders really do not exist, and that we should do all that we can to protect the least among us, particularly the country that's the richest country in the world. And we should not be sending people away who are obviously seeking our country for protection and as a safe haven.
And since you're a professor of political science, how do your students talk about immigration, and how do you talk to your students about immigration? Do you talk to your students about immigration?
I do. So I study American politics, and so certainly when it comes into when we discuss American foreign policy, but also as a key American political issue. It's on the minds of so many Americans every election, what to do with immigration. We've tried over the last 20 years 2 or 3 major things to try to get people in Congress to actually pass something so-called comprehensive immigration reform, and we failed each time. And so I talk about it with young people in terms of it being why is it a perennial issue that keeps failing? Why can't Congress agree? And then secondly, I talk about it with students from the standpoint of themselves. Some students, I have taught students who were DACA students. I don't think I have any currently in my classes, but I have had several over the course of the last 2 decades of teaching. And so I remind students that these are not, issues that are not related to their student experience either. What do you do if you were brought here as a child, and then your parents are sent back to their country? This is the only country you've ever known. You've lived here for you're 18 now. You've lived here for 16 of those 18 years, and you're supposed to go back to another place. That's not the American way.
And have you found a way to have kind of constructive conversations around the issue in your classroom?
Yes, there are constructive conversations. I think the challenge is that a lot of people don't understand how broad the immigration issue is, and that it's not just about our southern border. It's not just about so-called brown people coming into our country. I do think that people have a fear about the browning of America, both in terms of the literal kind of consistent interest that many other people who come from South and Central American countries have in coming to our southern border and entering our country that way. And I think we need to be honest and call it out as the racial issue that it is. If we were talking about Eastern European immigrants, we wouldn't be having the same kinds of conversations that we're having. But because for most people, when they think of immigrants, they think of brown people, they think of black people, they think of people who aren't bringing whatever they think that those kinds of people might be bringing in their minds, then what we're really talking about is not just people who are foreigners. We're talking about people who are people and people who, regardless of the shade of their skin tone, have a right to be in a country that allows them to fulfill their greatest potential.
And last question, what do you think the goal of the American immigration system should be?
The goal of our immigration system has to be to ensure the welfare of all people within the United States borders and territories. Whether you are a citizen or a non-citizen, whether you have gone through one process or another process of getting yourself here, we should be in the business as Americans and expanding people's opportunity, not limiting it.
Thank you so much for your time, Ravi, and for your insights.
Thank you.
Wally Podrazic, an adjunct lecturer at the University of Illinois Chicago, also talked to us about what he believes the goal of the American immigration system should be.
There we go. We're recording now. So do you mind just telling me your name, where you're from, and what brought you to the Unconvention?
Hi, my name is Wally Podrazic. I'm from Chicago, and I like listening and understanding, and the opportunity for both is obvious as part of this convention.
Well, this is a podcast called This Week in Immigration, so one of the issues that we're asking people is their thoughts about immigration. So let me ask you this. What do you think the goal of our immigration system in this country should be?
It probably should be the same as it's been for more than a century, which is there's new blood, new dreams, new excitement that comes into each community. I come from a Polish background, and there was a wave more than 100 years ago of Polish immigrants, and they basically were the foundation of a couple of neighborhoods, just as the Irish and the Italians and such have been. And right now in that same neighborhood in Chicago, there are Hispanic immigrants and Asian immigrants coming in and doing exactly the same thing. So the goal is to give everyone who wants a shot at the American dream a shot at the American dream.
So what do you think of how our current immigration system is working? What do you think is the biggest problem we need to address right now?
Clarity. Somebody comes in, and even if they want to play by the rules, sometimes it seems like the rules are always changing. So what do I do, and what should my family do, and how do I make this work? So clarity is key.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Have a good time at the Unconvention.
Thank you so much.
One of the panelists during the Unconvention was Michael Steele, former Republican National Committee Chair and Maryland Lieutenant Governor and a VPC board member. Theresa spoke to him about his thoughts about immigration and the Republican Party.
So welcoming to the podcast, Michael Steele, which is a little bit of a turnaround because I used to guest on your podcast many, many times talking about immigration. So now I'm going to ask you about immigration here at the Unconvention. So one of the big questions I have for you as somebody who's a former leader of the Republican Party, you've been around this game for a long time. The Republican Party has moved on immigration quite a bit in the last decade. What do you feel about that movement? Do you think it's been good for the party? And how do you think Republicans can maybe be constructive in sort of getting immigration moving again?
Well, I don't think they can be constructive at this point. So that part of it, I think, is going to be harder to do because of the move away from the issue going back to 2006. So the Bush administration was the last administration to really put forward a strategy to deal with immigration, and a lot of the immigration narrative revolves around the idea of broken promises. So when you go back in time, everybody said, okay, we're going to do this, make these changes, but in the intervening years, what happened was the number of illegal immigrants goes up, doesn't go down. So people look at that system and they go, what the hell? You guys haven't changed anything. In fact, another 3 million people per year coming in illegally. So when you have that mistrust kind of built into the system, it makes it harder to reform it, but it also makes it easier to exploit. And I think what we've seen instead of sort of directly tackling the requirements that members know that they have to do to actually put in place a solid reform, it's easier to demagogue and attack the system. And that's what we see playing out. I think if I'm making immigration policy as a Republican, I go back to what Bush did in 2004 to 2006 in that space that had a consensus of Democrats and Republicans and use that as sort of a baseline. I look at also what the Obama administration tried to put in place, particularly with respect to Dreamers and that narrative, and see how you can begin to reshape the conversation around those ideas. You're bringing a little bit from each side to the table, and it makes it harder for the members to then say, I reject it. Well, what part are you rejecting? The Obama part? Or you rejecting the Bush part? And so getting back into that space and having that conversation is what's required. But the problem is there's so much demagoguing going on, so much scapegoating immigrants and migrants now, so much denying those who have legitimate claims to come to the U.S. Their rights to make those claims, as we're just seeing with what DeSantis and others are doing with the migrant population. We're not in the space to have the conversation. When you're looking at where immigration is polling nationally, it's like 4th or 5th in the top 5 for a lot of voters, and that's because they've just given up trusting that something's going to get done here. Everyone complains about it, and
but nobody wants to fix it.
Nobody wants to fix it, and so we know how integrated this is. It's always been integrated into our economy, and to the fabric of our social life, always, from the very founding of the country, since they were immigrants. So
do you think maybe the Biden administration has sort of not addressed this in enough of a proactive way to mute any of those Republican charges? I mean, I think he's in charge now at the border, other than saying, oh, the border is closed, which, frankly, even from my perspective, is terribly laughable.
Yeah. No, I think the Biden administration has punted on this issue. It is gnarly for them. It is a distraction for them in light of everything else. The president has not been to the border, has not made it a centerpiece of public policy, which it should be. And I think the opportunity was there coming off the other side of COVID. As the country began to open up again, you could begin to speak narratively about how we want to address the immigration, because we know, particularly in my state of Maryland, we rely a great deal in our seafood industry for immigrants of all backgrounds, not just those from our southern border. We have a lot of European immigrants. We have a lot of Asian immigrants who come here seasonally to work. So there were some opportunities there in which a narrative could be established to begin that conversation, having twofold: one, with Mexico, and then two, with Mexico's southern neighbors, which is a very different conversation when you get to Venezuela and places like that. But we, again...
We're not having that conversation.
No one wants to have the conversation. The American people want us to have the conversation. They see the necessity for it. It's just that our elected leaders don't. I mean, it's like any number of things the American people want that our elected leaders don't want to have to deal with. From gun issues, 90% issue, people want reforms. Elected leaders are like, nah, screw it, we're not doing it. Immigration, again, 60, 65, 70% of the people, let's do something. Yeah, no, we're not doing anything. And that's why I stressed here at the Unconvention, and what I had to say is, we accept that, then don't complain about it. I mean,
so it's up to voters to hold the elected officials accountable.
If you want the reform and the people you put in place aren't giving you the reform, then take them out and put someone else who's going to do the reform, if it's that important. And if it's not that important, okay, let's move on, but stop complaining about it. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't sit there and complain about a reform, but then do nothing about putting in place the people or the strategies to get the reform.
So one of the things I hear is that every couple of years they come back and say, you have to reelect me or have to reelect more of my party because the other party prevented us from doing something. Do you think that's the right response, or should the voters say, but what did you do to get the other party on board?
That's just a bald-faced lie. It is so much the political DC inside game. Oh, poor me, I couldn't get the bill passed because the Republicans stood in the way or the Democrats stood in the way. No, you didn't want the bill passed. That's why. I mean, how many times do they call a vote on something just to say, okay, we're just going to get the temperature in the room?
They don't want to vote.
They don't want to vote. They don't want to vote. They want to collect the $187,000 a year paycheck. They want to eat at the nice restaurants in D.C., and they want people, when they go back into the community, to applaud them because, oh, my God, you're so special. Well, you're special, all right, but not in the way you think.
So if you didn't like what they're doing, why are they getting reelected?
Why are you reelecting them? I mean, I don't understand that logic. So, for me, a lot of it is breaking through. So when you're looking at something that is difficult, that has a lot of human tragedy associated with it, like immigration, we're called to respond on two levels. One, and I think the most important one, is a humanitarian level. These are our fellow human beings, for heaven's sakes. Fine, there could be a whole lot of circumstances around why they're coming, but in the first instance, we have to recognize the humanity of the individual in front of us or the families in front of us. And the second is a policy one. How does the policy reflect that humanity? How does the policy reflect our desire to make sure that people are given the right kind of help and access? Yeah, they're bad actors. We know that. We got the cartels and everybody doing doing the ugly, illegal stuff that they do. And we can deal with that part of it. But oftentimes we use those things as excuses to further diminish the humanity of the individuals that are coming. So when someone's, running from a totalitarian regime in in Venezuela, because their family's been threatened, because of the political pressures placed on them, the response is, oh, well, they're part of the cartel. They're not really, seeking political asylum.
It's another way of not dealing with the issue.
Not dealing with the issue. So I don't know if we are going to deal with this issue. I think circumstances will force us to deal with it, as circumstances are wont to do. And then, of course, we're going to deal with it in a moment of panic, right? We're all going to start, oh, my God, and overreacting, as we always do in these situations, and make the matter worse and come up with bad policy. And again, like I said, if I'm legislator for the day, then I'm taking the best elements of Democrat and Republican policies in this space, where the Democrats have lined up on DACA, where Republicans have lined up on border security, and figure out how you mind mill. Because at the end of the day, people don't want to stop immigration. They know it's a necessity. They just want people who want to come here legally, come here the right way, get in the right line, fill out the right paperwork, and we're good, right?
So manage it better.
Just manage it. And it is manageable until it isn't. And when
Right now it's not.
And right now it's not. And again, I go back to the fact that the administration is not, current administration, Biden administration, has not put any focus or emphasis on it because it's a political quagmire. Republicans just demagogue on it. They use racist tropes to describe to literally white suburban America. Oh my God, they're coming. We remember the caravans from 2018 election cycle. Caravans of what? Human beings? What are you talking about? But that is that kind of political back and forth, which makes this hard to do.
Well, Michael Steele, thank you so much for coming on This Week in Immigration. We hope that folks will be listening to your advice.
Same thing. Folks, get in the game. Understand you control the outcome.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Many of the delegates that we talked to voiced frustration about how the media and politicians talk about immigration and use the issue as a wedge. Here, we'll hear from PJ DeMuzio, founder of Creative Outfit, a video production company that works with Michael Smerconish, on how they work to cover issues like immigration.
Hi there.
Hi there.
This is This Week in Immigration, the podcast, and you are?
My name is PJ from Creative Outfit, and I'm here with Michael Smerconish, creating videos, telling stories, and hoping to do as much as we can to capture the day.
So this whole uncon thing was partly Michael Smerconish's idea. So how did he come up with this? What did he want to do with this?
Oh, that's a great question. As I'm not Michael Smerconish, I'm not exactly sure. I was just in there watching him orate for about 3 hours from 9 to 12 on
which he does like every day on Sirius XM. So he's got lots of thoughts on lots of things.
It's an honor to watch him live.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
And why he came up with this, I would say probably to just bring people together. He's always about keeping the door open. And when you bring people together from both sides, left, right, center, it's really cool to see what conversations are had.
He's got a wide following. Does he see this this event as a way to sort of try to mobilize them to do to be more active in politics, to try to engage with their elected leaders? What's his hope for this?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how often he's doing events. But I feel like with the Bipartisan Policy Center and Unite America and the Smerconish brand, he's kind of just bringing as many people together as possible. He just has such a big fan base that he will, as he says, put fannies in seats. That's what he does. He's like, my job is to put fannies in seats. And he did. If you we're looking out,
he did. I'm
over
looking at this crowd. One of the things, again, we're trying to see what we do on this podcast is we take the headlines and kind of go a little dive deeper, right? It's like, okay, you've heard about this in the news, say DACA. Like the children that were brought here illegally have a program that President Obama created, and the courts are ruling, frankly, right now that it's illegal and going away. How do we break that down? How do we talk about it in a way that people can understand what it's about and what's likely to happen and where the solutions lie? So, one of the things I think from media perspective is just having opposite opinions enough? Or do you think we need to, again, to drive action, get people to kind of take that and do a little deeper dive on their own?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there are thinkers and there are doers. So you kind of have to have a mix of everybody to make action and execution happen. So I think it's about team building as well. So it's one thing to have a radical idea. It's another thing to implement a team that can execute that idea. So I think in that case, bring as many people to the conversation, as many perspectives as possible to any problem in the world, whether it's immigration or something business related. It's always good to have a diverse set of perspectives so you can get to a solution in different ways.
Thank you so much, PJ, for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
Of course, thanks for having me. This was a fun surprise.
Delegates James Paradise and Alicia Keating voiced similar frustrations, but also talked about their personal experiences with immigration and what they believe the goals of our immigration system should be.
What is your name, where are you from, and what brought you to the Unconvention?
I'm James Paradise from Delaware, and my brother had an extra ticket and invited me.
Okay, so you're here on our podcast, This Week in Immigration, and I'm going to ask you some questions about immigration. So what do you think immigration should do for America?
I think immigrants in particular, lift up the country. We've got a whole bunch of illegal immigrants doing work that Americans won't do, for wages that are unconscionable, And that could be fixed if they open the borders and let people come in legally. Give them a Social Security number. Let them pay taxes.
So you think that fixing the undocumented illegal population is about expanding legal immigration?
Yeah, legal immigration solves that problem. These are people, working class people, looking for a better place to live.
And you think we can provide that here in the United States for them?
Well, we're certainly not helping the countries in Latin America provide better opportunities for people. So if we're not going to do that, then we need to open up the borders and allow them to come here.
Yeah. So when you see the newscasts and people talking on the news about immigration, do you think how they're talking about it, how does that resonate with you?
It makes me sick because the people who have the loudest voices are against open borders, and they're against illegal immigrants. They think illegal immigrants are ruining this country when that's just not the case.
Yeah. So
now, I'm a second-generation American.
Okay. So tell us your immigrant story.
And if my grandparents hadn't been able to come here legally, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah. Yeah. So you don't feel like the people that go on the news and what you see in the media represents what a lot of people think?
No. I think it's the same thing as most politics. The people with the loudest voices are the ones who are getting heard, and they're the people on both sides, way on both sides of the spectrum.
So do you talk to your elected officials when they come home to Delaware? Do you talk to your senators?
I've
and
actually
your
had a
congressmen
personal phone call with Lisa Blunt Rochester because I comment on her webpage all the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're trying to hold them accountable to listen to other people's views.
And the thing is, in Delaware, we tend to elect moderate politicians. I reach out to my politicians to say, you better reach across the aisle and get some stuff done in Congress. Because my biggest problem, and it's not poverty, it's not crime, it's not immigration, it's the fact that Congress is broke and there's nothing realistic getting done there.
Yeah. So you want your elected leaders to actually solve the problems rather than complaining about the problems.
Reach across the aisle, work with the Republicans, find people who will talk to you and get some stuff done for America.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your opinions on This Week in Immigration. I hope you enjoy your time at the Unconvention. So what is your name, where are you from, and what brought you to the Unconvention today?
My name is Alicia Keating. I'm from Derby, Connecticut, and what brought me here today was pretty much the concern about the polarization that we're experiencing in American politics today. I'm a student of the politics of divided societies, so I see what happens in other countries, and to think that it can't happen here is wrong.
Do you have an immigrant story in your background?
I don't personally. Oh, actually, I do. My housemate, my partner, came from Ecuador at age 18 about 50 years ago with $80 in the winter, and he bought himself a big jacket and slept outside for 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Found himself a job at a sweatshop and worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and somehow he managed to scrape together a really good life for himself. So, I'm kind of in awe.
Yeah. So when you look around and see how people talk about the issue of immigration today, how do you feel about that?
I feel really mixed. On the one hand, I know a lot of people who are here both legally and illegally, and they work really, really hard, and they're really decent people, and I can't say anything bad about them individually, but at the same token, there's this perception by some people, and I don't know if it's accurate or not, that the borders are just crawling with people who are pouring over the border illegally. And I did some research about coyotes bringing immigrants through the Sonora Desert, which is really deadly, and the Pima County coroner's office has like 200 freezers in their morgue because so many people die, and I just think something needs to be done. What, I'm not really sure. I'm kind of ignorant on what exactly is the true picture, I think is really what I'm trying to say.
When you see or hear politicians talk about it, do you feel like they are talking about it as in a way to try to solve it?
No, I don't. I think they're speaking to their respective bases. because their job to me is to educate as to what the real issues are and where the real problems lie, and I'm not getting that from either side. On the Republican side, we hear bad people coming through and they're illegal and they should be deported, and then the Dreamers should be deported, which is awful, and I can't imagine being in their shoes. And then on the other side, on the Democratic side, you get, don't treat them harshly, let them come in, give them some kind of succor, and there has to be a middle ground somewhere. I think with the gentleman, I overheard the gentleman before me saying that we need to, make it more legal. We do need to make it more accessible, and I think they need to be protected also, because if they're working off the table, off the books, and they're afraid of being deported, they're not going to report crimes. It's bad all around.
You said your housemate is an immigrant. Do you feel that knowing somebody who is an immigrant gives you a different perspective on the issue?
Absolutely. Because, I'm exposed to people in his culture, and the Latinos that I have met are very other-centered, and all of them seem to be driven to work really hard. Compared to, me, my family's been in the United States for years and years and years, generations, and I'm lazy. I'm lazy compared to him. He has to be doing something 24/7, and the way he goes to sleep is he's thinking about these projects that he has to do around the house and what tools he's going to need and how he's going to perform these tasks, and I'm like reading a book.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration. I really appreciate it.
Next, Theresa interviewed Nick Troiano. We'll talk about how structural democracy and election issues affect the ability of the country to address immigration and other controversial issues, and system fixes that could get candidates that more accurately represent the opinions of the majority of the American people elected.
And we're back at the Unconvention, and I am here with Nick Troiano, who is the executive director of Unite America. So Unite America is one of the co-hosts for the Unconvention this year. So Nick, tell me about why did your organization want to join in this particular project?
I think it's so important that we take our message directly to the public about what it's going to take to fix our political system, to reform our elections, and ultimately have a more functional and representative government. So this is a petri dish of Americans from across the country and across the political spectrum that we hope can germinate into some activism around the country as we advance these reforms to fix our politics.
We've heard actually a lot of the speakers today have talked a little bit about how immigration is a polarizing issue in our national politics. How do you see immigration and other issues like it being used in our political sphere right now?
I see the issue of immigration as a case study about how our political system isn't representing most Americans, because on various dimensions of immigration, you can get large majorities of Americans to agree. Why can't our Congress? And I think that goes to the fundamental incentives that members of Congress respond to. And that played out for all of us to see back in 2013 when there was an overwhelmingly bipartisan bill that got out of the Senate on a comprehensive immigration reform legislation, and it promptly died in the House. And it happened shortly after Eric Cantor lost his primary as one of the champions of bipartisan immigration reform, which sent a chilling effect across the Republican caucus, and they didn't even vote on the bill. So here we are, a decade later, some of the same fundamental problems still broken, 4 million dreamers in our country with no path to citizenship, again, despite large majorities wanting these things. And to me, it's an example of how the primary process in particular has distorted representation and fueled polarization to the point that we're not able to get big things done with big majorities until we fix the system itself.
So one of the things that came up a lot in 2013 when then Speaker Boehner declined to take up the Senate legislation was the so-called Hastert rule, which was this, and it's not a rule, it's a policy, if you will, but it seems to be followed by both parties, which is if I control the House or the Senate by virtue of a majority, I'm not going to bring anything to the floor that doesn't have a majority of my own party on board. And it seems to me that means that on immigration and a lot of issues, what you see is each party is like, let me get all of my side on side, and then I'll try to pick off enough of the other side to make it bipartisan or in the Senate to get it across. But that's a big challenge, and we've seen that with the 50-50 Senate we have right now. You know, Democrats tried to get a lot done by reconciliation with their own party. Immigration was part of it, and they couldn't even get all their own side on side. So do you see that as kind of emblematic of where we are, that this idea that everything, we have to start with everybody on our side first before we reach out to the other side? Is that part of the problem?
I think so. I think that not only do we not have government of the majority, we don't even have government of the minority. We have government of the minority of that minority, meaning like a small group within a political party that doesn't even represent a majority of Americans can block legislation from even getting to a vote. How do we call that a democratic system? It's not. And so I think we spend a lot of attention on who we elect, not enough attention on how we elect, because, again, it's that electoral process we have that empowers these small factions with such a disproportionate amount of influence and say in our system today.
Yeah, so what is your organization doing to try to address those incentives? And tell us a little bit about
why
that.
I'm here at the Unconvention and energized about this is because there are real solutions. You know, our Constitution gives the power to every state to set the time, place, and manner of their elections. That includes the way that we hold our primaries. There are 4 states now that have chosen to replace party primaries with a single nonpartisan primary, where every candidate's on the ballot, every voter gets to participate. The top finishers go to the general election, where whomever earns majority support wins. It's California, it's Washington, most recently it's Alaska that has a top 4 system. And why this is so transformative is that candidates from day one will have to campaign to earn broad support from the electorate, not just pander to the base of their party. And it liberates them to truly represent all of their constituents, again, not just the party activists. So this is a state-by-state campaign. Sometimes it can be incremental in nature. Here in Pennsylvania, where we are today, they're working to open primaries to independent voters. In Nevada, there's a ballot initiative this year that will allow a top 5 system to come to pass if it's approved by the voters twice, actually. So there's things that we're working on across the country and mobilizing more resources to these state campaigns.
Yeah, so I live in Virginia, and they have what's called an open primary, which means you can vote in a party primary even if you're not registered with that party, but you can only vote in one. Right? So one of the things that we hear a lot about, and I don't know if it actually happens, is voters crossing a party in the primary to try to pick somebody that they think their own party can beat better. Can you describe like the difference between that sort of a primary than what you're talking about, the sort of everybody on the ballot all at the same time?
Sure. So a fully open primary is when you can choose which party's primary to participate. In a nonpartisan primary, there are not 2 party primaries. There's one.
There's just one.
Which is why we call it nonpartisan, because the point of the primary is not to nominate one candidate from each party. The point of the primary is to winnow down the field from many candidates to a smaller number for voters to choose from in the general election. And it's that nonpartisan primary that I think produces the most competition, the most accountability, because you can have a general election in which there are more than one candidate from a single party. And so it's not just a binary zero-sum contest anymore. They actually have to campaign on issues that they care about and paint a vision for voters. And I think that's the kind of politics that can get us to talking about what are you going to do when you're in office, not just why are you the least bad option.
I hear about immigration, we talk about a lot, and certainly we hear about a lot as elections come up. It's one of those issues that what I hear a lot from candidates is the other guy didn't fix it, elect me, I will. And then 2 years later they come back and said, well, I couldn't fix it because the other guy wouldn't let me.
Right.
So they haven't fixed it. They keep coming back saying, try again, but they're not fixing it.
And what that shows is that the issue is more valuable to them not being solved than actually solving it, because they can continue to use it as a wedge. Mm-hmm. They can continue to say, this is why you should elect me, because it's not solved yet. And by the way, it's the other person's fault. And that gets to the incentive structure of the political system. As I was saying on a panel earlier today, we have a system right now where the more that members of Congress do their jobs, which is to work across the aisle and solve problems, the less likely it is they can keep their job, because they're going to experience the wrath of their party's base. No company could function like that. Our country can't either.
Yeah. We interviewed Michael Steele earlier today, and one of the things he said was that Congress would prefer not to vote because any vote they take, they fear can be used against them when they go, rather than being a vote for something, they see it as a negative. So Congress doesn't want to vote on anything.
Right. And there's a lack of accountability in the system, generally. Congress has a 20% approval rating, 90% get reelected.
That doesn't make sense.
Right, which is why, when I encounter people, as I did today, and they say, I have one thing I wish I can do to fix the system, and it's always term limits. Term limits are broadly popular, and I think it's because people are looking for a blunt instrument to say just enough, stop. We're getting the same politicians, the same outcomes, and they don't have any other tools to change that right now, and so they think about term limits. I think if we had truly competitive elections, we wouldn't need term limits.
Yeah. I mean, I have a different perspective as somebody who's tried to work on policy issues with Congress over 20 plus years. Having continually to educate a new group of members on an issue makes it actually harder because you don't have that expertise and you don't have institutional knowledge of how the place works to get things done. So I'm not necessarily an advocate of term limits. At the same time, I think every person who wants my vote should be accountable for what they've done, not what they've not done.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat, and but I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that so many people desire these term limits because they don't feel in the normal course of elections they have the levers of accountability they wish they did.
So you mentioned some of the states that your organization is working in. Do you see this as a growing movement nationwide?
Totally. I mean, there's been more statewide reforms just in the last 5 years than probably the last 20 or 50. Maine adopting ranked choice voting in 2016, now followed by Alaska with a nonpartisan primary and ranked choice voting system.
You just named two mostly Republican states, by the way.
Yes.
I think people think that these ideas are somehow more left-leaning, but you're saying there are conservative states that are adopting them.
Utah became the latest state to allow more municipalities and cities to use ranked choice voting, and they had 23 cities do that in the last election. Virginia nominated its gubernatorial candidate in the Republican Party through a ranked choice voting system. And then you have cities like New York City that adopted it, and there will be a couple more on the ballot this year. So we see it bubbling up around the country, I think largely in response to the fact that the political system is failing us, not just in solving problems, but we see the growing threats to elections as kind of existential, with the extremism that's coming through the primaries as undermining free and fair elections. So there's an urgency, I should say, about trying to fix this system before it gets too late.
Well, I hear the urgency in your voice, but I also see the enthusiasm for getting something to work. So Nick Troiano, thank you so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
And that's our show for today. If you want to see what the Unconvention was all about, check out the full-day video on the Bipartisan Policy Center's YouTube channel to see all of the panel discussions, policy lightning rounds, and other fun stuff. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Brown at BPC_T Brown, and I'm on Twitter at Hannah E. Tai. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler, Lucia Bebek, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Alex Verusco produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manu. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.